Story 1. I would be delighted to return to living as I did in the 90s. Story 2. People would actually go outside again. Half of us would be bored for a month, then remember hobbies exist. Story 3. Social media has become a propaganda and lying machine. We need decentralized media so people have complete control over the content they see and governments cannot decide what is allowed. Story 4. People would stop doing things online for attention and actually care about the relationships they build with others. Story 5. 14 days of withdrawal. The fog is lifting. Depression from 20 lost years. Healing. Story 6. I would go insane while simultaneously picking up every hobby ever. Story 7. Suicide rates would increase, as would road rage and domestic violence. Story 8. Honestly, it would be the best thing for a legitimate internet reset. Story 9. A drastic improvement in mental health across the world. Story 10. People would be much happier, and there would be far less misinformation spreading. Story 11. Many things would calm down. No instigators and no more spilling your life on the web. Story 12. We would be reliant on television, newspapers, and magazines to have a clue. Story 13. I would assume that includes Reddit. Honestly, it will be chaotic for a while because companies and small organizations will have to switch to physical media and television advertisements to get the word out. Also, many influencers would be erased and forgotten by the end of the year. Story 14. Mass suicides occur as people withdraw from a phone addiction that began in early childhood. Story 15. I would wipe the dust off my Sony Walkman, put on headphones, and listen to cool music. I would look out the window and watch life pass by while riding the subway to school. I would hang out with my friends more face to face. Life would be really good. My eyes would probably improve and I might get rid of my glasses. I could stop comparing myself to people who have more than I do, who look better, or who seem happier than I am. When did you say you were going to shut off social media? I am ready. Story 16. Kim Kardashian and every influencer will be working at Starbucks. Story 17. There has been a marked increase in suicides and suicidal ideation. Alienation from other people has occurred because computer contact has replaced face-to-face interactions, leading to widespread depression. This devastates people who grew up with a cell phone in their hand. This is my opinion based on the original poster's question. Story 18. I imagine everyone born after 2000 will become exponentially smarter and begin to redevelop critical thinking skills. Story 19. Two things would happen. First, there would be many upset, maladjusted people in places you would least expect. Second, nothing would happen, and life would continue as it had for more than 10,000 millennia. Story 20. Many YouTubers would struggle to hold down a real job. Story 21. 1. People would go through legitimate withdrawal symptoms. They would be angry and irritable for some time. 2. We would have less of a copycat mentality. I would bet we would see less crime, fewer murders, and fewer shootings. With these incidents out of sight and out of people's minds, social media would no longer reinforce them around the clock. People would also be more creative and original, rather than using social media as a template for life. 3. The economy would improve. I guarantee that one day a documentary will show that, for the first time in history, our inflation happened not because of coronavirus disease 2019 but because of social media. As soon as a few industries experienced shortages and raised prices, everyone else raised prices because they saw others doing it. Now we cannot figure out how to fix this manufactured inflation. Story 22. I think that, aside from businesses, we would probably adjust more easily than expected. Story 23. It would become an endless cycle of people checking whether it is working, and Down Detector would report an outage. Story 24. The political divide will begin to disappear. There will be fewer arguments and less anger. People will no longer start their day with an argument with someone they have never met, and they will not have politics and news forced on them around the clock. Story 25. Sorry, I live under a rock. Why would social media need to be shut down for a year, or is that rhetorical? Story 26. Many influencers will have to learn what the real workforce looks like. Story 27. I would love all social media to vanish and for life to be like the 1980s and 1990s. Social media is toxic and it is not going away. I know Reddit is part of that, but mostly I mean very short, quickly changing videos. All I use is Reddit. It gives me a headache to watch Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube Shorts. Story 28. A year without social media? I'd finally remember what sunlight looks like and maybe even talk to my plants. Time to rediscover hobbies I promised myself I'd start in 2018. Story 29. There would be more live music, and that is not a small thing. Story 30. I grew up before social media. I would probably be happier and more at peace. Story 31. It was like before social media, people actually picked up the phone and talked to one another. They were not glued to their phones in public. People socialized and played outside. They did not put everything that happened in their lives online. Story 32. Mental health would improve and disinformation would decline. Story 33. I think you would see many influencers who cannot hold down a 9-to-5 job struggle. Story 34. A lot of phones would stay in their pockets where they fucking belong. Story 35. At first there would be a spike in violence and outbursts as dopamine levels stabilized. Then tensions would subside, and people would become more productive. Story 36. Messenger pigeons would make a comeback and we will refer to those messages as tweets. Story 37. People might be able to free themselves from their devices long enough to notice their surroundings. Story 38. The shutdown was made permanent by the 6-month mark, as people realized how much better their lives were without social media. Story 39. Why cannot I post that Lionel Hutz picture where the thought bubble shows rainbows and people dancing? The Simpsons has an image for practically every scenario imaginable. Story 40. It will not be shut down. It will simply become so poor in quality that people will stop using it. This is happening now. Story 41. Some people may begin to repair the extensive damage it has caused to their brains. Story 42. Many people would be paranoid that they are missing out. Within 24 hours of the return of social media, things would revert to how they are now. Story 43. Everyone under 25 would go totally insane without the constant stimulation. Story 44. I would be excited. People might get upset, then quickly forget and not care. Story 45. I think you would see a dramatic change in mental health, either an increase or a decrease, whichever is better. Story 46. You would see a lot of healing once we were bored enough to talk to each other. Story 47. Nature finds a way. The only way you could shut down the mass adoption of bullshit would be to eliminate every means of mass communication that has been developed since the telegraph. Story 48. Chaos at first, a period of denial, and a long road to clarity and prosperity. Story 49. The world would be an infinitely better place for a year. Story 50. I would love the quiet that comes from the general stupidity of the public being off the internet, but social media tends to be where I get most of my book recommendations, so I would miss that. Story 51. I have a nice range of how-to books already, basically topical mini encyclopedias. For anything more, I will go to the library to research the advanced material. I am always wanting to learn more about everything, but it does not always have to be right now. I miss those days. Story 52. Remember during the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic when dolphins played in the quieter canals of Venice? It would be like that for the human soul. Story 53. Many startups will create new social media sites within weeks of the old ones shutting down. If someone tries to ban them, they will fall. Story 54. Women would have to complain about their dating life or seek dating advice from their friends in real life instead of from their online admirers. Story 55. People would be less mean, and a lot of healing would take place. Story 56. I think many content creators and influencers would lose their composure, especially those who do it solely as a full-time job. They would be forced to find other sources of income quickly. Story 57. Would love it. Beyond Reddit, I quit 10 years ago. If someone is actually your friend, they will call or text. Story 58. It would improve society because people would not attack one another to virtue signal. Story 59. Make America Great Again implodes because it does not have Russian bot farms to protect it. Story 60. Overall, people would be happier. We would not see most of the garbage that we are used to seeing these days. Friendships and interactions would be real. You would spend time with the people who really matter to you. Story 61. Republicans wouldn't be able to spread their stupidity and terrorist propaganda so easily to their inbred cult. Story 62. The whole world would calm down except the people who caused the hysteria. They would melt down. Story 63. People would spend more time outdoors and take time for themselves, traveling and taking photographs for their own enjoyment, rather than to share online. Story 64. There would be a lot of confusion at first, and people would be afraid to do things without someone seeing, sharing, or approving their actions. Overall, I think people would be better off and happier, and there would be a surge in public gathering places, pubs, cafes, and possibly libraries, as well as local sports and hobby groups. I would still enjoy single-player personal computer games. Story 65. It would not affect my life whatsoever, so I really do not care. I hope it is bad. Story 66. People would learn how to go out and socialize with real people. Families could talk about their day and their lives at the dinner table again. We would have discussions with each other and look for information in books that we know are accurate. We would believe most of what we see with our own eyes. Life would become much better. Story 67. Project 2025 becomes a reality. The Handmaid's Tale comes true. No more elections. Trump could be in a coma with his sycophants running things in his name. Television news under government supervision. Instead of brown shirts, it is camo shirts everywhere. Papers, please. Eventually, you will be required to take a tattoo as an American citizen in good standing, the mark of the beast. Gay, lesbian, and transgender people and mixed-race marriages would be illegal. Story 68. The world would freak out for about 3 hours, then calm down. Story 69. The world would improve after the initial shock of the first month. Story 70. There are mostly bored kids and frustrated people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Otherwise, nothing. People will call friends and pass the time with something else. Story 71. I would be forced to go door to door to show people my dinner. Story 72. A modest increase in outdoor activities and in people's general health, and a significant decline in political noise. Story 73. I grew up without it and was fine. Many people, however, would have mental breakdowns without it. Story 74. Mass hysteria. People jumping from their penthouse suites, like during the 1929 stock market crash. Story 75. It would not hurt my feelings at all. I have just started dabbling and might be getting back after a 3-year hiatus. Story 76. I would see fewer of my drunk, divorced, over 40 co-workers half-naked, oiled-up bodies in the people you may know section. Story 77. Human sacrifice. Dogs and cats living together. Mass hysteria. Story 78. Unless I can find a way to communicate with my close Discord friend without social media, I will be very lonely. Story 79. People will learn to be humble and to self-reflect. By taking up hobbies, they discover interests that genuinely nourish them. Story 80. Many people would no longer be able to hide behind their screens and speak disrespectfully. They would have to get a life. Story 81. There is extreme panic for about 2 or 3 days, followed by calm, with everyone realizing that they can still eat, sleep, and go about their lives as they otherwise would. There may be a modest uptick in people watching television news after that. Story 82. There would be mass confusion and chaos. All these people saying they would be okay or delighted are delusional. Story 83. Finally, something to do with that drawer full of flip phones and other old cell phones. It would be interesting if, without social media, people really started making real-time, old-school phone calls with their friends. Story 84. People will find that their neighbors feel the same way. We want low taxes, manageable expenses, and a nice house to live in. It is not that hard. Story 85. Everyone will lose their shit. Not me. This is the only social media I have. Story 86. We would have a couple of days of false rejoicing, followed by an uprising. Story 87. I'm not sure which businesses I should give my money to or boycott. Story 88. Insecure people cannot post pictures and think others are impressed. Story 89. Early on, I decided not to join Facebook because I wanted to continue liking my family and friends. People no longer have a filter. My aunt was the only family member who used it to keep in touch. Everyone else used it as a sounding board for their agendas. When my husband became annoyed with something there, I told him he could fix it by getting off the site. Story 90. An economic collapse would devastate modern society. Without social interaction, people's sense of self would erode. This would lead to a widespread social catastrophe. Story 91. I think many people will reconnect with reality, embrace solitude, and spark a resurgence of genuine face-to-face friendships. Story 92. If you listened, you would probably hear society healing. Story 93. Most fear of missing out would disappear, and as a result, much political discourse would calm down. Story 94. It would be an interesting social experiment to see what would happen if we shut down social media. Back in my day, I would come home from school, do my homework while watching my shows, and message my friends on Microsoft Network Messenger to see if they were ready to go outside with our bikes and relax. We had no smartphones. Microsoft Network was our only way to communicate, and we came back home when the streetlights came on. Story 95. People would be much happier. You see the best of people on the internet and compare it to the worst in yourself. Comparison is the thief of joy. Also, influencers would be out of work. Story 96. Remember how clean the sky was during those 2 weeks when everything was locked down in 2020? Story 97. People would talk to their neighbors and the community again. Story 98. I would celebrate and post a party invitation on Facebook. Never mind. Story 99. If it includes Reddit, I would be pretty bored for a year. If not, nothing would change for me. Laughing out loud. Story 100. Honestly, I think there would be mass protests. People have become too dependent on social media. Story 101. A new one would pop up just as suddenly as the others were shut down. Story 102. People would feel less connected but in a better way. I see it as a net positive overall. Story 103. People would be unreasonably angry about social media for maybe a month, and then it would be fine. Story 104. People would go out more. I'd actually be able to talk with people who are not endlessly checking their feeds so they can return to doom scrolling. If Discord were shut down, people would use regular text messages and respond instead of saying, "Don't check my messages. I'm always on Discord." That would be a great. Here, imagine the complete shutdown of YouTube, all video game consoles and servers, and all apps on phones except photos, files, and perhaps internet access. We might have a year of real socializing. Maybe people would write letters again. I grew up with all these things, and I wish I knew what life was like without them. Story 105. I would start turning off my headlights in the drive-thru. Story 106. I would largely lose my business. For many small businesses, social media, especially Facebook, is essential. If you properly monitor your business's social media, it is invaluable for spreading accurate information and keeping customers engaged. Story 107. That would be amazing. People would be happier, probably become smarter, and it might bring the country back to reality. Social media is the real heroin that is killing the nation. Story 108. If we add reality television to that mix, the world would heal itself. Story 109. Cue the video clip from The Simpsons that imagines a world without lawyers. Story 110. A dramatic uptick in the number of adults acting like children. Story 111. That would be great. Sounds chill. We could even ditch the whole idea of it coming back. This algorithm thing is getting tiring anyway. Story 112. Many people would become distraught. It would be a disaster. Story 113. The world would be a better place if it were not turned back on. Story 114. Cookers return to being cave dwellers instead of uniting on Facebook. Story 115. Better mental health for everyone. How can we make that happen? Story 116. Might ground us back to life and restore our roots. It is very sad. I feel disconnected and isolated. Perhaps we are fixated on what we watch, pausing our own lives and neglecting loved ones. Story 117. I would finish all the projects around my house and have a lot more money. Story 118. I think we would see more people outside talking to each other. Story 119. Riots later evolved into smaller pockets of peaceful protests, while many people found new ways to occupy their time as they reached the stage of acceptance. Once the year ended, many found that social media was causing problems and either cut it off completely or returned it to its original purpose of keeping in touch with relatives. Story 120. Bars and other physical entertainment venues would see a renaissance. Story 121. I could return to my creative life without distractions. Families could find each other in the same house again instead of hollering through their cell phones. Time for dinner. People would make eye contact when talking instead of glancing at their phones and responding with casual interjections. Story 122. We would all be dancing in the streets, having a gay old time, Flintstones style, rocking out. Woo! Story 123. It is about to happen to children under 16 years old in Australia. Let us see how it works. Story 124. Not enough people are talking about the economic repercussions of shutting down social media. Many industries rely on social media to function, and many jobs exist because of social media channels. I personally need social media for work because that is how I market my services in the performing arts. It is how clients contact me and see my work. If social media shut down, many people in my industry and others would have trouble finding work. Not to mention the marketing aspect. Businesses, large and small, established and startups rely on social media to get attention for their products and services. If social media shuts down, many businesses would suffer. Do you realistically think small businesses or sole proprietors like me can afford the high rates of traditional advertising such as radio, television, and print? The return on investment would be terrible. Social media is inexpensive and effective. Traditional media cannot replace its marketing power. Story 125. Where would you draw the line between the internet and social media? For example, can Gmail be considered social media? Story 126. Radio would be dominated by right-wing commentators. The internet would be considerably better. Story 127. Life would not go back to being normal. If social media disappeared, the United States would be a mess because magazines and in-person shopping have declined so much that what we knew is barely available anymore. People would be depressed and confused. Story 128. Trump might have to focus on his job instead of bragging about it. Story 129. It would be like the previous generation having to give up mobile phones and beepers for a year, and the one before that giving up television and videocassette recorders for a year. Great angst and anarchy. Story 130. I believe it is in the best interests of news channels to promote and report the truth. Story 131. The world would be happier for about 6 months. Then we would invent something worse. Story 132. Perhaps people would stop living in echo chambers and begin to understand things more accurately. Of course, this assumes eliminating outlets such as Fox News Channel and MSNBC, the cable news channel. Story 133. It will be chaotic for those who depend on social media for income, but things will adjust. Story 134. We just saw a government toppled by this exact thing, so I believe it would not end as well as people think unless its return were guaranteed. Story 135. Mental health problems would spike during the first 2 months, then continue to worsen over the next 10 months. When social media use resumes, problems would spike again. Story 136. Does YouTube count as social media? Does Reddit? If you only watch YouTube, it is just a collection of videos. Likewise, if you do not engage in the social interaction on Reddit, it is no different from any online bulletin board that has existed since the earliest days of the internet decades ago. Story 137. The same thing that happened when Itchy and Scratchy started loving and sharing. Story 138. I can easily survive without social media as long as I can do online banking and pay my bills. I don't want to go back to mailing checks for every bill. Story 139. Many people realize they do not actually need social media. They may be bored and on edge for a while, but eventually it becomes a thing of the past, and after a year many do not return to it. Social media is an addiction. I speak from experience. Story 140. Hey original poster, I've chewed on this a bit. I'm an abrasive asshole, so take all of this with that in mind. The idea is childish. To believe taking something so poorly defined as social media down for a year even deserves serious debate is ridiculous. Someone more patient and careful might try to guide you to that realization, but that is not me. I want to mock and laugh at anyone suggesting such a thing. Maybe someone already has. I'm going to jump to what I think you are really mad about and do not understand because you are too ignorant to know. In my opinion, social media is where you, or a persona, public front and act charade you present is the product being exchanged. Commercializing your personality, persona, life, relationships, privilege, views, and so on. That is what it has become. It distracts from what social media was, is, and continues to be, a reflection of society with money taking center stage. A cesspool of reality. We get upset over someone selling themselves or acting stupid for the gram or whatever, but we do not talk about the reality of cyberstalking, harassment, and bullying that underpins every social media platform that does not educate and enforce the common sense practice of keeping your personal details off the internet. This was not such a big issue when the internet was still technically difficult enough to keep most people offline. The old forums were small enough to be handled by community moderation, and without fail they would implode and splinter after reaching a critical size that is not feasibly moderated by humans. Then Facebook made social media as personal as it had ever been, literally putting your face online. It has been a shit show since. We missed the prime points to regulate things well. Extreme measures are historically dumb as shit. Culturally we need to do better, but I have little hope the golden days online can ever be recaptured. Nor can we expect anything to get better until we work through some shit. Story 141. Mental health would improve drastically worldwide. I am not kidding. Story 142. You're essentially asking what would happen if the internet went down for a year. I certainly would not be in a happy state. I rely heavily on the internet for my social interaction. Is it the best way? Not really. Words and text lose a lot in communication, but without it I could not communicate with the great being that is our combined consciousness. For the record, Citizens United says my idea of this form of God is real and a person. Theirs tends to be smaller and involve fewer individuals. Story 143. I believe the first thing that would happen is that most millennials, influencers, and creators on sites like OnlyFans would have a meltdown. They would crash harder than if they had 4 cups of coffee a day and suddenly had to stop. Withdrawal would hit hard. People who depend on income from social media would have to find new ways to make money and might turn to crime or scams. National media outlets would report the downfall of social media or predict its return, unless new authoritarian rules were imposed. A new group of white-hat hackers might try to restore social media in some form, or everyone formerly on social media might move to podcasts from now on. Social media has both amazing and horrific aspects, and everything needs balance. I love learning from YouTube and hearing stories, but I have never been a fan of social media. I believed in the brilliance of Aaron Swartz, and it is still sad that things ended the way they did. Story 144. People would reconnect offline, news would slow down, and some industries would scramble, but life would adapt. Story 145. More can be accomplished by progressive people, but this may disadvantage those confined at home or living in a care facility. It is good for them because it keeps their minds active and alleviates depression. Interaction with others and exposure to different viewpoints is a major benefit and something we did not have before social media. We tended to keep to ourselves and hold our opinions privately. Now we can contact people we thought we would never hear from again, instantly by sending a message. Story 146. People would likely be less angry. At least one large study in the Journal of the American Medical Association Network Open found a correlation between high social media use and increased irritability. Story 147. Initially, I would go crazy. Then I would learn to be more human and live more humanly. Story 148. Most far-right organizations would collapse due to a lack of coordination and bot activity. Story 149. I'd prefer to keep messaging services up at least. For example, no Facebook but keep Messenger. mainly to keep up with my friends worldwide. Story 150. People would be forced to socialize in person. Wouldn't that be great? Story 151. The level of intelligence would increase for some. The mental health of everyone who is addicted to it would improve beyond measure. Story 152. It would be great. Just shut down social media, rest, and keep everything else. Story 153. Many children and teenagers would experience mental health crises. Far-right parties would lose influence, and the industry would implode. I am all for it. Story 154. Our world is so interconnected and held together by social media that we would not be able to cope if all forms of it were down for a few days. A year without it would be unimaginable, and people would likely take advantage of the lack of functioning communication systems. Aside from that, many people might find it easier to find meaning in their everyday lives. Story 155. Many small businesses and creators would close. Story 156. People will become more productive within a year, narcissistic behavior will decline, and fewer people will develop phobias about interacting with others face-to-face. Shut it down now. I will not even miss it. Story 157. First, there will be protests. There are two cases. 1. The government restores social media within 1 year. 2. The government supports a ban or shutdown of social media, and people realize ordinary life is better. Second, a world in which the government provides social media leads to destruction. A world in which the government supports shutting down social media returns to the 1990s, and people live happily for another 80 years. Story 158. A sudden spike in productivity followed by mass confusion about what to do with our hands. Story 159. A significant decrease in the need for mental health care. Fewer people are experiencing triggers. Story 160. Many mental health problems will be resolved or reduced. Story 161. You could get around the gym more quickly because there would not be people sitting on the equipment on their phones for hours between sets. Story 162. For me, less doom scrolling and more doom article scrolling. I cannot stay away from information, laughing out loud. Story 163. We can return to how things were in the 1990s when people actually read books and newspapers, went out and talked to others in real life, pursued tangible hobbies, rode bicycles, walked in the park, and enjoyed activities from before social media took over our lives. Story 164. Productivity would rise by 20% or more. Right-wingers would lose many votes. People's mental health would improve. Story 165. People yearn for it, but when offered it, they will not sacrifice their phones. Story 166. Bring back a bit of empathy to humanity. Our endless orgies are a result of everyone's boredom. Story 167. People might learn to socialize and be considerate and nice again. Doubtful. Story 168. It depends on what you mean by social media. If only platforms like Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook shut down, the world might be in a better position. People would go outside, interact more with each other, and procrastinate less. If basic messaging services such as short message service are disrupted, major parts of our world would collapse. Story 169. I think my kids would not know what to do with their time. Story 170. I would not see the same content reposted repeatedly. Story 171. People would talk more in real life. Mental health might improve. Some businesses would struggle at first. Story 172. Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. Story 173. Many right-wing extremists and members of Alternative for Germany are simply losers. Story 174. People would be happier and better connected in real life, more relaxed, and make choices about what they truly want to do instead of what makes picture-perfect social media posts to gain likes and followers. Story 175. I have not had a Facebook account for a while. People from my past who had easy access to my current life did not appeal to me. I would rather go back to memorizing phone numbers than have to deal with Trump headlines every day of the week. I am starting to hate visiting Reddit because of it. Story 176. It would take much longer than that to fully undo the damage it has done socially and culturally, but some signs of recovery would begin. Story 177. Amplitude modulation talk radio and those garbage newspapers would explode. Story 178. People might feel lost, but mental health and real-life connections could improve. Story 179. I like social media because you can learn from people, to be honest. Story 180. People would have to be in contact via email, phone calls, and text messages. Story 181. It would be wonderful. For every good thing it does, there are about a dozen bad things, especially when it prioritizes advertisements and outrage over being reasonable. Story 182. If all social media were shut down, Trump would pretend to agree to shut down Truth Social while keeping it running. Governments and civil justice groups would sue to force compliance, and he would fight the cases and run down the clock until the year ended. Story 183. All the whiny internet trolls will have to leave their parents' basements and learn social skills. Story 184. That picture from The Simpsons in which Lionel Hutz imagines a world without lawyers. Story 185. People would finally talk to each other and panic about missing memes. Story 186. I would have peace and quiet for a year, but I would also have to get a normal job which would make me want to die. Story 187. People would have to confront reality again. That would be beneficial for humanity. Story 188. New ones would pop up like dandelions in spring as fast as they could. Demand would drive supply. Story 189. Trump's influence over the minds of his followers would become virtually non-existent. Story 190. To be honest, I dislike social media, but I work in marketing. I did not go into marketing expecting to handle so much social media. I was just a fan of Mad Men and similar shows. If social media disappeared, I would probably be out of a job. On the other hand, one part of my role relies on email marketing, and it would have much more value given the lack of other channels. I might be less depressed and perhaps have a better job. Alternatively, executives might decide that marketing is unnecessary and I would lose my job. Story 191. People would revert to having an attention span of more than 30 seconds. Story 192. Anxiety levels would drop worldwide. Large pharmaceutical companies would suffer significant losses because fewer antidepressants would be prescribed. People would socialize more and visit one another as they used to. Heart disease and obesity would decline as people became more active. Overall, the effects would be positive. Story 193. I do not need social media. As long as I can text and call people, I am fine. Story 194. Many people will be unemployed. Some may become suicidal. Millions may suffer severe depression, and numerous businesses will be shuttered. Social media has become the primary communication tool of the modern world. Story 195. Hopefully people will start talking to each other like we used to, but most likely they will sit and pout about not being able to click like and save animal videos or deep thought clips. Story 196. This may sound self-serving, but it would be great. People would return to sending meaningful handwritten cards and notes, making recipients feel much more special than simply clicking and swiping. Every time I have sent a handwritten note, it has sent the recipient over the moon. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.